Hello everybody and welcome to Tech Tuesday. It's quite an inventive name. This is Evan Edinger Travel/Tech, and today I'm going to be telling you how to get the best quality video you can on your camera, no matter what camera it is. Sony, Panasonic, Canon, Fuji, I don't care. We're going to help you today get the best quality video you can out of that camera. They do say the best camera is the one a photographer has with him. Doesn't really matter. I'm not asking you to buy a new camera. You don't need a new lens. You don't need a new kit. You can do amazing stuff with the camera you have as long as you know how to use it. Spend some time, go through the menus, or watch this video. This is part one. This is going to be part of a 2 or 3 part series where I go more and more into detail on how you can shoot better video. For this one, if you are pretty experienced with video, you might find this a bit more of a refresher, but the next ones I'll be going through my HLG3 workflow, Slog 3 workflow, color correction, stuff like that. But just for the beginning, in this video, we'll be talking about how you can go from just shooting all auto to shooting automatically hot stuff. Usually the first step someone makes when they want to shoot better video is they stop using auto exposure techniques. Now, sadly, this is also the final step they take. They turn everything off of auto and then they're like, yep, I did it. I'm a videographer now. I made it. Spielberg's coming to my house. The first step to shooting better quality video is using the tools at your disposal. So most all cameras that have been built in the last 5 to 6 years have a function called zebras built in. I highly recommend that as the first step here, you're going to turn that on. Now, sadly, if you are using a Canon crop sensor APS-C camera, well, you're a bit out of luck because Canon like to keep back a lot of standard features so that they force you to spend more money on their other products, which also cripple the products so that you spend more money on the next product. They're pretty bad, but Canon bashing aside, if you do have that as an issue and your camera company have not provided you with the basic functionality of zebras, you can download a free program called Magic Lantern, put it right on your SD card, put it into your camera, and then boom, you get the functionality that all of us already have. And so, now that we all have zebras, please be sure to turn that on. A lot of people just use the default button layout that their camera comes with. I wouldn't recommend this. This is your camera. This is your tool. Make it the best that it can be for you. So for me, I'd mess with the zebras all the time, and so I have mine set to C4 on the back of the camera here. For this video, just to put it simply, I want you to set that to 100 plus. What this is going to do is make it so that all the spots of the video that are overexposed are going to have this zebra line around it. See that? Can't see anything there. There's no data. None of this stuff is actually going to be shown up. When I put this in my editing program, you're just going to be seeing blown out white. There's no data there. You can't recover it. However, if you turn on the exposure a bit, wow, look at that. Ah, the zebras are going away. How useful of a tool. Further on in the series, we'll also be going over how you can use this same zebra functionality not just to find out what's overexposed, but what's exposed at the exact value you want, such as skin tones and grays. But that's for a further video. The other thing I want to make sure you do right now before we get any further is to go and find your white balance. My white balance is set to C2, but it's probably in your menu somewhere. C2, there we have our auto white balance turned on. Now, here's the thing. You might think auto white balance is really useful and you don't really want to change it. However, this video isn't called how to shoot the most okay video you can. It's how to shoot the best quality video, okay? I'm trying to give you a little help here. Just turn off auto white balance. Turn it on to something at the very least like daylight. What daylight means is that at least you have a consistent white balance through the whole video and it's not going to change. Or even better yet, pick yourselves up one of these. It is a gray card. You can get a small little gray card like this on Amazon for like 7 or 8 pounds. It's a really good investment. Basically, by having one of these, you can immediately set the white balance exactly to what it should be in the camera, ensuring that you don't have any guesswork. This is exactly how the colors should be. Gray cards are incredibly easy to use for something like this. Make sure all your lights are on in the way that they will be for your filming. Point at the gray card and then central button, bam. You've now just set your white balance, 5500 Kelvin. Perfect, because that's also the temperature of the light I'm using, so I know that's correct. And now, the video I'm shooting has a proper white balance. Now, you might be thinking, well, that sounds like a lot of extra work when auto white balance seems to be doing the job for me. And I totally understand where you're coming from because I was also at that stage at one point. However, the issues that come with auto white balance happen when you are filming in an area in which the lighting can slightly change. If you're in a full studio environment, you're probably not going to want to use auto anyway because you're going to have a white balance card. But if you're using, let's say, natural lighting coming from the window, not now, it's currently nighttime, but if you're using natural lighting coming from the windows, fun fact, most windows are a little bit green tinted. And so if you're going to have natural lighting coming through a window, depending on how strong or weak the sunlight is affecting in your video, it's going to throw a green hue. And if you're using auto white balance in this guy, well, guess what? Throughout the course of the video, as your lighting changes, your white balance is just going to ebb and flow and change. And it's kind of a bit unnatural. It throws a bit of people off, especially if the changes are a little bit less subtle. Let's just say the sun just pours through the room and then the colors go all over the place. This also really affects you when you've been color correcting video, because let's just say you've color corrected part of the video. Oh, but now the auto white balance, the camera tried to fix it because the green came in through the window and oh no, now all the color corrections weird. Your skin looks like you're Shrek. Listen, it's a nightmare. Just don't use auto white balance. Just set the white balance to at least daylight. Otherwise, get yourself a gray card. Also, really comes in handy when it comes to color correction. All I have to do is color correct this part. It's amazing. So now you've got your zebras turned on. You're not going to have any more overexposed shots. You've got your white balance set, meaning that your colors are going to be accurate in the camera. And then the final and most important set involves manually exposing your shot. Now, I always used to hate it in school when a teacher would just tell me to do something. And when I asked why we did that thing, she would just say, because that's the way it is. That's not a good teaching method. That's not a way of learning. And so I find a lot of people that have started manually exposing their cameras, which is a good idea to certain settings, have only done so because people have told them what to do and just told them to decrease the numbers, and they're like, okay, hands off, I did it. However, hopefully with this video, by the end of it, you're going to understand why we do the things we do when we want really good quality video. So there are 3 different ways for light to enter your camera: the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. Most important of which being the aperture. That's the one we're going to be talking about first. Now, usually when people are just starting out with messing with their camera settings, they'll be told, just drop that aperture down. It gives you a blurry background, and then they sit back, they're like, cool, did it. And they don't know really why. So what's happening here is, let's just say your camera lens is shut. There's no way of getting light into the camera. However, then you make a very small hole, and then you slowly make it larger so light can come in. That is the aperture. The aperture is that hole, and the larger that hole is, the more light can go into your camera, and the less light you need to add digitally, which would increase noise. So ideally, you want to have your aperture as fast as possible, a smallest f-stop as possible, such as 2.8, 1.4, or whatever the smallest number is. If you have a kit lens, for instance, sometimes those are like f3.5 to f6. Well, then f3.5 would be the fastest aperture, the aperture that you want to set your lens to. This one specifically I'm filming on now is a 1.4, and so for that type of shot, I've got it as small as possible, meaning the hole letting in light is as large as it can possibly go. Now, I don't have to have it set this way. I can actually move it up to 2.8, move it to 3.5 if I want. The main reason on why we're doing this and why I'm specifically doing this is because by having it more wide open, it creates more separation between myself, the object in focus, and what's going on in the background. And so you can really tell the story of what is going on in the video a lot easier if there's a separation between the subject and the background. And so with that f-stop being, let's say, f8.0, there's going to be no separation. There's going to be no blur at all. So the blur isn't necessarily just a thing of, oh, I really like the way that blur looks. And it's more like you can really see the difference between the subject and the background. And that's primarily why it's done this way. But like I said, it's done to taste. Some might say that this amount of background blur is a bit too much tone. It's way too much. However, personally, I like it. I think it looks nice and buttery. That's why I like shooting like that. So for this shot right here, for the example, I'm going to turn my wheel until the aperture here goes down to 2.8, which is the fastest that this lens can do. Good. However, it looks a bit bright. Now, my next step is setting the shutter speed. Shutter speed in the camera is how fast, traditionally in a DSLR and other form of camera, the shutter would go down and would allow light into the camera. So you've got basically the size of the hole, and then you have a shutter that goes whoop, whoop. And so how much light is getting in? Is it through 1/50th of a second? Is it through 100th of a second? And so the faster that is, the less light is getting through because you're only allowing it to get through for such a small amount of time. For the shutter speed, just make it 2 times your frame rate. Evan, what's my frame rate? Well, if you're in the UK or EU, you're probably shooting at 25p, which means set your shutter to 50, you're good to go. Are you in the US? You're probably at 30p because that's the NTSC electrical grid. And so you're gonna be using 60. That's 2 times your frame rate. Pretty easy. Or if you wanna make something #cinematic, just shoot at 24p, change your frame rate in your camera, and then double it for the shutter speed. Now, in my opinion, there's not that much of a difference between shooting at 24p and shooting at 25p. So I just shoot at 25p because that is PAL. It's the PAL system in the UK. That way, when I'm shooting, I don't have any light moving around on screen because of the different electric pattern to the frame rate. I hope I'm making sense. But to explain this in a simple way, I hope you can understand. I want you to right now just move your hand in front of your face. Try and look at your hand. You can't really see every bit of it. There's going to be a bit of motion blur because your eyes aren't perfect. I know it's hard to hear, but your eyes, they're not perfect. You're going to have motion blur. And so when you are shooting with a frame rate and a shutter that is double it, it's going to create that bit of motion blur that's very similar to the human eye. And so we inherently find that more aesthetically pleasing. And that is basically why you should be shooting with these settings. because it's more aesthetically pleasing and it's more similar to how we as humans are. But this all depends on the story you're trying to tell. There are certain action films and war films and horror films in which they crank the shutter up really high so that you don't see any blur at all, and it's almost a bit jarring to see every single bit of detail. However, also a lot of GoPro videos and action videos like that use a very high shutter so you can see a more hyper-realistic version of the world, and that could be your shooting style. For this video specifically, if I'm trying to help you shoot a video the most aesthetic way possible in this way, I'm going to say just shoot it 2 times your frame rate. So in the UK, 50, in the US, 60. Everywhere else, well, I don't know. Would you check what your frame rate is, just double it. So on my camera here, I'm going to be moving the shutter speed down to 50. Good. Now you might see automatically, wow, thanks to those zebras, everything is quite overexposed. How do I fix that? Well, because you've just let in a lot of light naturally by making the aperture the lowest it can go, the 2.8, and you've just made the shutter 1/50th of a second. Well, now you've let in so much light, you don't need all the digital exposure that is added by adding the ISO. And so now just turn that ISO as low as it can go. Ideally, you want your ISO to be the native ISO of the camera, the lowest that can go. And for this one, for instance, it can go all the way down to 50. I wouldn't necessarily recommend 50. Look into your camera to find out what the native ISO is. I don't want to go into that, but for all intents and purposes, you want it to be as low as possible to have the smallest amount of noise. In most cases, the higher your ISO, the noisier your video is going to look. And by noise, I mean, it looks like, if you zoom in, very small moving colors in all the different dark and bright parts of the video, and also sometimes in the midtones. Now, after following all these steps, having the aperture as low as possible, keeping your shutter to 2 times the frame rate, and lowering your ISO as low as possible, you might run into a couple problems. Problem number 1 is, after doing all these steps, you might think, well, it's still way too dark. I have to raise my ISO to higher than 800, and now it's starting to get noisy. What should I do? Easiest tip, expose your video better, expose your subject better, increase your lighting, turn up your lights. That is the number 1 way to fix that problem, and basically the best way of doing it outside of just cranking your ISO and making it too noisy. Now, on the alternate end, you might have the other problem, which is after turning your ISO all the way down, it's still way too light and everything is overexposing. And in this case, you have 3 possible options. 1, crank your shutter. I don't recommend it, honestly. Like I said, if you really want to have that nice cinematic look, you want to keep that shutter at 2 times your frame rate, don't do that. So I'm going to pretend that option wasn't even said. We're not going to talk about it. 2, crank your aperture. Oh, but then you're going to lose that separation between the subject and the background, and you're going to lose that blur, so you don't want to do that. All right, that option's already taken away. What's the other option left? I'm not giving you the finger. The other option is invest in a neutral density filter. I'm currently using a variable ND filter on this. You can get one for like 30, 40 pounds on Amazon. It's basically like a dark piece of glass that you put on the front of your lens so that you can maintain that really nice aperture, that nice separation and blur, get that really nice double the frame rate motion blur, and not have to crank the ISO so that there's a lot of noise. It's basically the main way that a lot of people film that want to have this look. And so with this type of dark glass, this one, for instance, is a 2:5, so I can turn it like this. And now the video is significantly darker. Let's just say I had way more lights on. Let's say the sun was pouring through. This would be exposed really well. However, at the moment, you can tell it's not. And so we're just going to turn that back up to only 2 stops, and now everything looks good. And so, like I said, pick up a variable ND filter if that's the problem you have. I'm assuming you will if you have a good lens. Otherwise, don't worry about it. But now you've done it, you've crossed the threshold, you're now exposing your video manually, not automatically, and you're having full control over how the video looks and making it look as best as possible with the best quality possible. Now, how can you get more dynamic range, shoot with a better picture profile, have a different gamma? That's coming to part 2, so subscribe if you like this stuff, please. I appreciate it. I'll be doing a video on the Sony a7 III, a7S III, the a6600 series, so because a couple of my friends have those types of cameras. So I can talk about how I shoot with different gammas, what my workflows are, and basically how you can hopefully learn from how I do it and make better content. If you like what I'm doing, I mean, tell me, I do appreciate that. I spend a lot of time on the tech and that side of this, and so that's why I'm kind of doing this video series at all. I just enjoy talking about it. So thanks for indulging in this weird thing of mine. I hope I was helpful, at least to people that are starting out, or maybe a good refresher if you guys didn't know about zebras or setting your own white balance. But I'll see you on the next video, way more advanced. I'll see you then. Goodbye.